And I know what it's like to be outside the establishment and to be throwing bricks at the wall and to be ignored. And I know what it's like to be sitting at the table and being heard. And that's where I am now.
When I met Bernardine Evaristo, I was immediately struck by the clarity and courage of her personality. She doesn't compromise, and yet her thinking is full of nuances, far away from cliches and easy to handle stereotypes. At the same time, she's not afraid of being very proud of sitting at the table with the establishment. So join me in meeting Bernardine Evaristo. Welcome to the Book of My Life. My name is Jagoda Marinić. I'm a writer and host of the show, and I'm happy to lead you through 1 hour of talking books, life, and the world. My today's guest is Bernardine Evaristo.
Welcome. Hi, good to be here. Looking forward to talking to you.
So happy to have you here. Well, I even don't need to introduce you, but I will say a few words. You are the winner of the Booker Prize 2019 for Women, Girl and Other, a book that I think shook up the literary world in a way, also due to the way you then responded to the questions people gave to you, to the book itself, to the characters it portrayed, to the way the success it also had, it meant for you. And you have now, because there were so many questions on who you are and how you became who you are, written a manifesto, which is interesting because it is about not giving up, which I like. So welcome to this show. I'm glad you took your time to be here. We're going to talk about the book of your life, or the books of your life, books that shaped your thinking, that shaped the way you approach the world, maybe your own writing and reading. And you have brought a book to start with, which I'm very curious to find out about. Why did you pick this book? Would you tell us, and what does it mean to you?
Because...
Well, maybe just tell us first which one you picked. So.
Yeah, so Audre Lorde's book of essays, Sister Outsider, she came back into the public domain probably around the time of the Me Too movement, so a few years ago. But she was a really prominent black feminist in the 1980s when I was a young woman. And she was actually the most prominent black feminist. And so I grew up in London. I was born in 59. By the time it was the early 80s, I was in my early 20s. I had become a feminist. I was lesbian during my 20s, so I was also a lesbian. I was also learning about my black identity because I'd grown up in a very white area. And I was in theatre. I trained at drama school. I was running a theatre company called Theatre of Black Women. And I was part of this community of women of colour artists and white women, but predominantly women of colour artists who were wanting to become creative professionals in a world where we weren't welcome. There was literally no interest in us as artists. And, we were what we call minoritized in a majority white society. So we were seen as different because we were women of colour. But also, we came from different cultures and we were drawing on that to varying degrees in our practice. But also the experience of being black in Britain at that time was something that kind of bound us together. And we needed role models. We needed thinkers and leaders who were older than us, who had been there before and to whom we could turn, who we could perhaps emulate, who would help guide us through this quite hostile environment as creatives. And there wasn't really anybody in Britain at that time to do that. So just a little history lesson for those who don't know. Most of us were what were called second generation Brits. So that means that one or both of our parents had come over from the former colonies a generation earlier. So my father came from Nigeria at the end of the 1940s, and a lot of people had parents who came from the Caribbean. And sometimes it was like both parents came from the Caribbean, or you were mixed race or biracial, so one parent would be maybe from the Caribbean or maybe from Africa, and one parent would be white. And when they came to Britain in the 40s, 50s, 60s, they were immigrants. It was an alien country. they were outsiders and they were struggling to survive and provide for their children. So very few of them went into the arts, which just wouldn't have been an option. You know, people went into the National Health Service, they went onto the railways, they worked on the bus services, they worked in factories. You know, there are very particular professions that people filled. And they had children, and they had to provide for their children. So their children, my generation, had the luxury of choices, of, you know, choosing a career in the arts, those of us who did. And so we couldn't turn to our parents for guidance, not really, because they didn't know. They weren't aware of the arts world, so they were completely divorced from it. But there were African American women in the States who were then called Black American, not African American, who were a generation or two older than us, who were powerful Black women and feminists, who were carving out a space for themselves in the arts. In particular, I'm thinking of literature. And they come from the culture is very different in America, always has been. You know, they have a lineage of Black people in America going back 400 years, whereas in Britain it's much more fragmented. And so they also have historically Black universities, and just demographically, there are many more of them than there are or ever were Black people in Britain. So they were the powerful figures who we turned to, but not because we, on the whole, knew them, because, of course, this is all for the younger people. This is way before you could just send a tweet to Roxane Gay, for example. Yeah. These African-American women were available to us through the books that they wrote, but they were only accessible in one bookshop in London called Sister Right, which was a feminist bookshop. And because at that time, of course, there was no Amazon, there were no online book retailers. So you had to go into a physical bookshops. Again, I'm talking to the really young people just to remind them of the world as it was. And this was a really important bookshop because it imported all kinds of women's books from around the world. And so in a way, that was my feminist education through going to that bookshop. And then I discovered Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, various other writers, but also Audre Lorde. And she was such a powerful spokesperson for Black women. And she was so unapologetic. And to my mind, she was brilliant. And she was also kind of respected in the wider feminist community, which, you know, we felt very not disrespected, very alienated from that community, because there was white feminism at that time. It wasn't, the intersectionality wasn't really a term. So there were white feminists, and so if there were white feminists, we were going to be Black feminists. And Black feminists also included women of the African diaspora, but also from the Indian diaspora and Asian diaspora. So anybody of colour, really, would have at that time in the 80s aligned themselves as Black. And we were interested in issues that related to us in terms of how we were seen as people of colour. It wasn't just about gender. And so she became a bit of a heroine for us. And then she came to London a few times. And so we got to meet her. Oh. And so that was very special.
And when you say we, it's your theatre group? Or who was it?
Yes, somebody else from the theatre company, Patricia St-Hilaire, who founded the theatre company with me. So we met her, and also other women in the arts, writers, visual artists, and so on. And so that was very special. But at the same time, I remember her kind of giving us advice. And I would have been about 23 at the time. And I remember thinking, don't tell me what to do.
Oh.
Yeah. And okay. Which is why I have to be really careful how I talk to young people today, because I feel very protective and I want to help guide them, but I have to be really careful that I don't tell them what to do.
Wow. So you went there because you needed a role model, because you needed guidance, and the books provided you guidance, but when she was there and wanted to provide you guidance, you felt defensive.
Yeah, I didn't say that, and I was quiet. Yeah. But inside, I really remember very strongly feeling like, I felt like she was patronising us.
And what was she telling you, actually?
I can't remember. Oh, yeah. But I felt like she was patronising us, and that's not to say that she was, but she was coming from such a powerful culture, America, African Americans, and we were like the poor relations, and also much younger. So she probably did have a particular way of talking to us as an older figure.
And they had their own narratives built out. Like you said, they had Toni Morrison, they had their ways to tell their stories. And sometimes we speak of people of color and, you know, the Black identity, but then the variety of the Black identity.
That's true.
And as you sat there with your own identity, and she maybe wanted to impose you another identity, which is very interesting to figure out that it's not the Black identity, but
that's
the
right.
Black identities.
I remember going to a festival it's somewhere called the Melkweg in Amsterdam, and it was a women's theatre festival, and it was incredible because there were women's theatre companies from all over the world, and there was a company called Flamboyant Ladies of 3 black women, and I was 22 and I was there with Theatre of Black Women, so we got to know them a little, and they were African American, and I remember one of them saying to me, "Oh my God, you sound so English," and I remember thinking, well, that's what I am, but in her mind it kind of meant that I didn't sound black, because for her, black was sounding like an African American. So really, she was saying that out of ignorance, but I felt it as that there was something wrong with me because I sounded really English. But why wouldn't I sound English? Because I was English. You know, this is where I'd been born and raised. It's interesting to say that at that point in the early 80s, Toni Morrison wasn't the big star that she became. It was Alice Walker, The Colour Purple, which was such a powerful book, and also Steven Spielberg made it into a film. So that was a global phenomenon, and she was the leading black woman writer of the time. And she described herself as a womanist. So she was very feminist in that way. But Audre Lorde was the more edgy, radical outsider who would say things like, "Your silence will not protect you," or "The master's tools will not dismantle the master's house." I hope I've quoted her correctly, which actually I disagree with now.
Oh, why?
Yeah, because I'm inside the establishment and I'm transforming it from within. And that's what I'm doing. But at that time, I would have agreed with her.
But would you, I mean, when you say you're part of the establishment, and people who think like Audre maybe, or are influenced by that thinking, would say you are now part of the establishment. I mean, would they actually give you the credits for what you're doing? When you say, I am changing part of it, they would say you are profiting and turning into it.
It is an interesting dilemma, but I'm very clear about what I'm doing and who I am. And I know there will always be people who will be casting aspersions about me and saying, she's a sellout, she's a coconut, she's a this, she's a that. And maybe my younger self would have been doing that to somebody like myself. But they don't also understand what I'm doing. So when I do assume establishment positions, so for example, professorship at a university, if you're a professor at university, you are part of the establishment. I'm president of the Royal Society of Literature, the Royal Society of Literature, right? So that is an establishment role.
And you're the second woman, I think, and the first black woman, right?
First person of colour in 200 years. Yeah. You know, I write for the national newspapers. They are part of the mainstream of society. I am somebody who is definitely within the status quo as it is, but I am changing it. So I think there are two things. One thing is if you assume establishment positions and you perpetuate the status quo, or you assume establishment positions and you still have your radical politics. And I still have my radical politics. And I know what it's like to be outside the establishment and to be throwing bricks at the wall and to be ignored. And I know what it's like to be sitting at the table and being heard. And that's where I am now. And those very people who may be criticizing me are actually going to benefit from what I do, because I'm an activist. I set up lots of literary inclusion projects, arts inclusion projects. That's what I do as a writer. And that's what I'm using my platform for as a writer who's now won the Booker Prize.
So when you speak of change, that's the concrete change that you're trying to provoke in a way, to say that you are opening doors to have it easier for people that are even against what you're doing. It's, for example, cultural appropriation. Do you deliberately contradict in interviews when you say, no, I do not think it's so important? Why do you do this? And
I don't like people making assumptions about my politics or my beliefs. And I think people do. Because I'm a woman of colour, because I'm outspoken, because I'm clearly left-wing, they will make assumptions about where I stand on political issues. And I think there is a problem with our society today in terms of mob mentality, especially on social media, where everybody has to agree with each other, and arguments become very polarised and there is no nuance left. And I find that really problematic. So when people make assumptions about where I stand on issues, I have to correct them and say that, and I'm not just doing it to being contradictory or, contrary. I'm actually talking my truth, which is that I'm more interested, I think as artists we should have freedom, right? I actually think we should have complete and utter freedom, right? But there are also consequences to the freedom that we choose to take. And I am not saying that those are good consequences at all. You know, we know what happened to Salman Rushdie, and we know how awful that is. And I can't think of a single writer, probably anywhere in the world, hopefully not, who would approve of what's happened to him and the fatwa from 30 years ago. And it's terrible, it's tragic, it's horrific. But on a smaller scale, you know, if a writer wants to write beyond their own demographic and inhabit characters and create lives that are not from their community or their background, why would you stop them doing that? You know, how limiting is it for writers to only write from their own background? You know, and I don't really see, I see that as a very simplistic way of looking at creativity. So I think people should have that freedom. And I also question whether they get it right or not, you know, because there are questions of authenticity. Particularly with particular religions, right? There are certain codes that are established and that people recognize as part of that religion. But in lots of ways, people are very individualistic. So you can explore that with your characters. And I think if you were to say, well, only a black person can write a black character, then what you are saying is that you're reducing blackness to something that is to do with colour rather than our shared humanity. Because as writers, what we're really doing is exploring our shared humanity. But there are things that people might get criticised for, and sometimes that's completely valid. But as a principle, I feel we should have that freedom. So cultural appropriation, one of my issues, and I'm going to write an essay about that, which is going to be for the British Academy. So I'm delivering a lecture for the British Academy. It's a very establishment organisation, right? But I'm going to talk about cultural appropriation and what we mean by culture and what we mean by appropriation. Who owns culture? Because I think culture is something that is fluid and has evolved through time, through global interactions, and I'm not sure that we can claim to own culture, right, to the exclusion of everybody else.
I personally agree with you, but then again, I know that there would be a lot of people saying that you, by taking this standpoint, actually, yeah, in a way foster, or a token, as they like to say, you know, you can be used so, like the white supremacists can say, look, and here is a successful, famous, renowned writer, and she's colored, and so, you know, if she doesn't have a problem with it, why do you have a problem with it?
I think one of the challenges right now is that the arguments are too simplistic. So my contribution, as it is from lots of other people, is to introduce the grey areas, the nuance, because that is from my point of view, that's the reality. And people may disagree with me, but that's fine, right? But I'm interested in how we can bridge gaps together, how we can build bridges, how we can move forward as humankind and actually get rid of these divisions while acknowledging that those divisions exist for a reason. I'm talking about like racial divisions or gender divisions or whatever, or sexuality divisions or class divisions. You know, they exist because we're living in an unequal world. But I cannot just have an ear to the people who want to perpetrate or perpetuate simplistic arguments, because I'm not prepared to do that. And the fact is, I will speak my truth and it will land where it lands.
Bernardine, when you, yeah, I'm excited. I'll be observing the process. But when you look at your 23-year-old self and the debates now, and that you now have to make these things clear, what do you think has changed for you as a writer, for you as a reader? With your last book, you wrote about characters. How much does this influence the way you shape your characters or the fantasy? As you said, is there the human experience on the one hand, and then these whole societal debates that we're leading, and very aggressively, partly. So when you look at back then and now, what do you feel has changed, both for you as a reader? Do you read books differently? And how do you treat these changes, or how do you handle them?
Well, I think my 23-year-old self was I was immature, but then that's not surprising. I was 23, right? So I was immature, and I did have very simplistic views because I hadn't really formulated my theories about the world as an adult. I was still coming to an understanding of how the world operated, and I was finding my way with it. And also things were very simple. I was quite, angry at society at that age, which I think is completely understandable. And I didn't understand the complexity of anything really. And that is something that has developed as I have matured. And as a writer, I deal with the complexity of who we are as people. And that's actually what people like about Girl, Woman, Other, for example, that the characters are very nuanced, and that also makes them very human. But I think the very people, and that would include maybe my younger self, the very people who like me doing that with the book might then disagree with what I have to say about some of the big issues around, because they don't want that complexity when it comes to politics. So one of the most important things to say about back in my early days, and you're talking about the 1980s, is that whatever conversations we were having with each other. You did not have a social media account whereby you could make random statements and reach thousands, if not millions, of people. It was a very micro universe that we inhabited, where it was just us talking to each other.
I think that's so interesting, because today we speak of these bubbles we live in, which in a way is true, but I have the same feeling as you have. I feel that I'm totally hyper confronted with all sorts of bubbles, and that actually it's the opposite. In a way, you do have a bubble that's a comfort zone, but we used to call that peer group. And I felt that these peer groups were in a way much more closed, and you were much safer than nowadays. As you say, no matter what you publish, no matter what you tweet, you get the whole portfolio of opinions.
I mean, it's interesting, I think you said it was safe. It was safe because it was contained. Right. And you would fall out with individuals, you would have face-to-face rows, but you would also have thrash-out arguments. And arguments aren't really thrashed out on Twitter. People just make statements, because there isn't really the scope for people to have fully, when you have 285 characters.
Again, the nuances, the complexity, Even if they have threads, it's again one thought that they're just sending out press conferences about this one thought.
That's right. And also it lends itself to outrage. Right. You want to make an impact. So the more outraged you are at whatever you're objecting to, the more impact you're going to have, right? So a nice reasoned comment isn't going to get a lot of traction. And so in order, for my generation, growing as an individual, politicized in the arts, mixing with young people my age, was it was a learning experience that was private. The media wasn't interested in us. Nobody was reporting on us. Nobody from my community was writing for the newspapers. We were completely divorced from that. And it's only in the last 20 years or so that started to change. So, but it meant you could change. That was the other thing. You could change because only a few people knew you. And in any case, if you were going through a process of change, you'd have those conversations with those people. Whereas now, when you're making public declarations about yourself, it's much more humiliating, perhaps, to step back when you've come in so forcefully for or against something.
I think there's one story that I find, almost like it's transformative when you talk about your first love that was so abusive in this.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so I think by telling her story as a fictional character, in many ways, as soon as you write her, it's not about her, it's also about what she represents in your book. And what did you understand in this experience of a first love that you thought maybe would be liberating from patriarchy, from male dominance, I thought that is a crucial moment.
It was a crucial moment, you're right, because I was in a relationship with a woman, so in my 20s I had relationships with women, and the woman was more dominating than any man I'd ever come across. So I was crushed as an individual in that relationship, and I was a really strong feminist at that stage. Well, I still am, but I was, I had become a very strong feminist, but I gave my power away. And I see it as that. I gave my power away because I don't like to see myself as a victim. So this person was actually coercively controlling, but we didn't use that. That wasn't part of the lexicon then, because we have developed in terms of, as a society, in terms of how we understand abusive relationships work, because they're something that we discuss. But I don't think in the 80s that was really being discussed. I mean, Oprah Winfrey, I think, you know, she was one of the people who brought it to public attention, didn't she? All the the taboos, the hidden areas of our lives. And that wasn't until maybe the late 80s, when people might then...
That's interesting that you mention her, because when I got to know her, I was, wow, she's giving space to these people. She's giving space to these topics. And as you beautifully said, she sets it up into the light. I find it interesting that you refer to her.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I've always seen her as a force for good, actually. She likes a particular kind of narrative, you know, and if you don't write that kind of narrative, she's not, you know, it's not the kind of book she would promote. But certainly, so there I was, stuck in this relationship with somebody who was controlling and actually crushing my personality and crushing my creativity, and yet it was a woman. So I think that was a turning point for me, because I said I've been quite simplistic in my thinking, and I was quite negative about men in my early 20s. You know, all men are bad. I hate the patriarchy. They're sexist bastards, right? And then here I am with somebody who is more controlling than most male-female relationships. So then I think that's perhaps the beginning of me understanding the complexity of the human condition.
And I think the beginning of something that you bring into writing that's very interesting for us as readers. And I also love, if I may say, I don't know if it's, but I mean, it's out in the world. You said that during that time you still lived with a man. When you had a female, or not with her, but before with a female, you talked about that in an interview. And I loved when you said that's something my current self, my today's self would not do. And you really harshly judge yourself, you know, you're like, because I was a very selfish, I don't know what you called yourself. But I think there's so much, this critical view that you have on your own actions, on your own life, not just on other people's lives, is also liberating in a way.
Oh, that's good. That's good, because I wanted to be honest.
Yeah.
And I wanted it to be self-interrogatory.
Right.
I didn't want it to be me presenting myself as the victim of circumstance. And that's something that you do sometimes get in memoirs. It's like, oh, I was in this terrible relationship for 10 years. Whereas what I'm saying is I chose to be in that relationship for 10 years and I lost myself. And then I found myself when I left that relationship and was much stronger as a result of it. Therefore, I do not regret it.
Yeah, and I'm even treating other people differently because I learned lessons about myself, which is not just I'm keeping bad, abusive people out of my life, but I'm also learning how to be better to other people.
That's right.
And that's the complexity that I enjoy about the way you treat your characters. Or even your own character, your alter ego in your manifesto. When we speak about writers with a heritage, I would say in brackets, because everybody has a heritage, but it happens that everybody who is not like from the mainstream society or ethnicity, we come to be talking about our ethnicity a lot, you know? Do you see a dilemma in this, that in a way, you know, simply as you said, they looked at us as if we were different. And simply by their gaze, you also treat something that is actually not different to you, that's who you are, as something that has to be inspected, inspired. And how hard is it to come to a natural narrative, or is it possible, or how do you conquer that thing of, no, I'm not different, and they have labeled me that?
I think what I did was, because I wasn't accepted, I mean, on one hand, I was accepted, you know, I did not spend my childhood alienated and alone. Right? I was very much part of the school I went to. I was very much part of the youth theatre. I had friends. Our family was the bogey family in the street, yes. So, you know, because we were a black family in the street, and so the house was attacked and so on. But I don't want to present my childhood as one of hardship in that way, because it wasn't. But because I was treated differently, it made me then choose to research my father's history and also the wider African history. And then that has also gave me a vocation in terms of what I do today. So as an artist, I was never somebody, well, I just want to write stories, but I don't know what I want to write about. I was somebody I want to put on the map stories about the African diaspora because that was missing from my childhood and that shaped me. But the interesting thing, which I talk about in Manifesto, is that it is the colour of my skin and my features and hair that mark me out as different as a child. In every other way, I was a British child, but people saw me as different. Therefore, I became somebody who felt that I wasn't accepted. If I had been somebody who could what we call pass as white, and there are lots of people of colour who may be also biracial, who can pass as white, I would have been completely integrated into that society, away from my family, depending on how dark my family were. So that's that. So what I'm doing is I'm exposing the ridiculousness of race in a way, because we know it's a fiction, because we're all 99.9% biologically the same. But that difference, that visual difference, is the thing that shapes and determines our lives. And I see that as a positive thing. And I had to come to an understanding of myself as a biracial black person in my early 20s, which then gave me the foundation for the person you see before you today.
How do you, I mean, when you say you were a British girl, but then they looked at you as if you were different, and you write about this, how do you treat anger? How do you handle it?
Yeah, so as a child, I wasn't angry at all, because you just absorb your environment and you don't even know how to articulate what is happening to you. So you're walking around living your life, but you know people are treating you differently, but you don't know what. And actually what you do is you internalize it. So you feel there's something wrong with you rather than there's something wrong with them. And that's the tragedy, isn't it? That actually there is something wrong with them. And you know, as I say in the book, centuries of colonial brainwashing made British people years ago look at anybody of colour as subhuman, as savages, as uncivilized, and also as not belonging in Britain itself. And so you internalise it. And then the anger came when I became sort of politicised in terms of feminism and race in my late teens, 20s. And then that fueled me for a bit. Although, to be honest, my writing wasn't always that angry. You know, my writing wasn't like ranting, wasn't polemical. And then the anger kind of dissipated. And I learnt over the course of my early 30s to find energy. You know, I say anger turned into energy. And I think energy is a very positive thing. I did an event, was it last year, and somebody I hadn't seen since I was at drama school came along to the event, and she had been very angry at drama school, and she was feminist, and she had spiky hair, and she still looked the same. And she said to me, she said, I don't understand, because I've been talking about anger. She said, I don't understand, why aren't you angry? And she said it really angrily to me, as if I should be angry. And I said, anger is now energy. You know, she scowled at me. I just thought, oh my God, I kind of know how you've lived your life, because you have been raving all your life. And I bet she's not productive. You know, she ran off before the event finished because I wanted to talk to her to see what she's doing. But I just thought, how can you be an angry person walking around this world for decades? You know, you're actually destroying yourself in a way. You're not destroying anyone else, you're destroying yourself. And so that is always my answer to that. Energy.
But that's a huge dilemma at the moment, I think, in all these conversations about the people say we have to like free anger from the labeling that, you know, not being angry is a form of control. That's like the one stream. You know, you have this, you know, you're not angry, you're suppressing, you're not angry.
I don't know about this.
No,
okay.
So there's a lot of books even out on feminist books, like how can we be more angry? We have a right to express our anger. And I'm always hesitant. I'm like, okay, if I express my anger, what am I doing all the time? I'm running around being angry. So what is that doing to my life? It's not changing, as you said, the suppressors situation. And on the other hand, people like you who are really dealing with this subject, and even in Toni Morrison's interview, I found one thing that I really enjoyed where she said, I quit anger or something. And I think she said it that because it actually makes her irrational, and she can't concentrate, and she's not in her full strength when she's angry. And I understand that, you know, it's, so I think it's very interesting, and not the stream that I see in the current feminist, even intersectional feminist movements, where we think, yeah, we have to be angry. No? Now, smash the patriarchy, now be angry.
That's interesting, and I think that probably is a stage people have to go through, but I don't see how they can sustain it for a lifetime and also stay productive. And I also feel that if you want social change, anger isn't always the best way to get that. You know, I feel that there are people who need to be very vocal protesters, you know, as I said, throwing rocks against the citadel. But actually, I'm more interested in how can I strategize to get the result that we're looking for? And I think anger makes the people you're trying to change really defensive. I don't think it's necessarily productive. I don't think it's the cleverest way to achieve results, but I can see that there is a place for it. But as individuals, I feel that it is a phase that you have to pass through in order to survive.
When you say you're now part of the establishment, a professor in these royal circles, when I think of this young, angry Bernardine and now this established Bernardine, what of the angry is left when you walk through these halls or when you're at these meetings? I mean, there's a lot of privilege that we associate with, I don't know, the white elite or with capitalism. And how do you feel when you're there? And this old self, how does it look at it?
It's all research. It's all research. I find it fascinating. So, you know, I did have what's called an audience with Camilla, who is now the Queen Consort, about 2 months ago, because she is patron of the Royal Society of Literature. And I've met her before, you know, because she hosted a reception after the Booker Prize for myself and Margaret Atwood and other people, and she's come to Royal Society of Literature events. And when, you know, so she was living, this is all the past tense now, everything's changed, but living in Clarence House with Prince Charles, who is now King Charles III. Mm-hmm. It's very hard. It's a really hard shift to change how we describe the royal family. And I'm fascinated. I'm absolutely fascinated by how people who have had lives completely unlike mine live. And I kind of do see it as research, but I'm not angered by it. I'm interested in working with those institutions. And
do you still have this difference thing that you say, as a kid you said I was a British girl and they made me feel different?
Oh no, I feel very different today. Mm-hmm. Britain has changed beyond belief. Mm-hmm. So, you know, especially in the big cities, especially in London, which really is a state unto itself, you can be from anywhere in the world and at a certain level feel fully integrated. But I'm not talking about equality. I'm not talking about that there isn't racism, because it does exist. But just going about your business, people aren't going to look at you as if you're some kind of stranger, because everybody is, you know, from a different part of the world. 300 languages are spoken. But yes, there is discrimination. The police will target black men walking the street or driving their cars at night and the rest of it. But the city I grew up in was one where people would look at you, and they would treat you differently, and they would call you names, and, you know, you would feel that you don't belong. Whereas now I feel 100% that I belong, and I have felt that for a very long time. And it's also an internal, it's internalized, and it has to be internalized. So I feel that I belong in my country, and if anyone thinks otherwise, I don't care. Do you know what I mean? Because I know who I am. There we go.
How much of this do you owe to books?
A lot to books, isn't it? You know, that's how one of the most important ways in which we educate ourselves, isn't it? Through literature, through non-fiction, through exploring ideas, through exploring other lives, through writing my books. You know, all the exploration that I've done about what it means to be a person in this world, what it means to be a person of colour in Britain and the African diaspora, and feeling acknowledged and validated by other writers out there. I think literature plays a really important part. It's also given me a strong identity in myself as a reader and as a writer. Yeah.
And you strongly stressed in conversation that you protected your creative talent. You protected it from an everyday job. You protected it from the world. I found this also fascinating. So how did you have that security to know, well, it's books, you know, it was acting, but soon you figured out, you know, actually I write the plays. And How did you know that where did this come, how did it feel? I mean, it just was, you might not know where it came from.
I don't think it was actually, I didn't feel secure. I think my life was very precarious, but I could live with that precariousness because I was so committed to my creativity. Obviously, there are people who go into the arts who have very secure lives, who become very successful, and or choose professions where they're always regularly working and so on. But a writer doesn't earn much money unless they do, and most writers don't earn a lot of money. Nobody's really waiting for your work. And but I knew that was the only thing I wanted to do. It was almost, I think, there was no other choice, because I wanted to be fulfilled in what I was doing in my life. And so that was writing after theatre, and I had no choice but to do that, because otherwise I would have left a part of myself behind if I had stopped writing, if I had taken a job that would have given me a regular income and then given me a property and given me all the kind of material things that people aspire to have. I aspired to be a creative person and to lead a creative life, and that's what I did. But it was at the cost of not having sort of financial security, and I felt it, but I didn't resent it, because I was doing what I wanted to do, and that was really important to me. And so many people I've known in the arts gave up.
How do you define creativity and creative life for yourself?
So working with the imagination, creating something from nothing. I'm talking in particular about the writing that I do, which is across genres. It's not just writing books and fiction and the memoir, but it's also writing commissions, it's writing for theatre, it's writing for radio, it's creating an imaginative world that is my unique thumbprint, that is unique to myself, and that is my voice in the world. And that is an intoxicating thing, I think, to be able to do, irrespective of how many people are really paying attention to you.
We have one last question that we ask every guest. And you might know the Obama's reading list, summer reading list. You know, every year he comes out with this things he's reading, which is for many a recommendation, what's worth reading. If we were to send out Bernardine's summer reading list, a few titles, which ones would you recommend that we read after this year? What have you read this summer, and what would you say is your summer reading list?
Yes, well, I read, early in the year, I read The Dutch House by Anne Patchett, who, of course, is a huge writer in America, and I absolutely loved it. And I didn't understand why I hadn't read her earlier, because she's had a very long career. I also read the Nickel Boys by Colson Whitehead, who's African-American writer, and that was a very short but a very powerful book. There's a book called Assembly by a writer called Natasha Brown, and she's a very new writer. It's a very short book, but it's a really punchy, powerful, political, beautifully written book about a black woman trying to survive in the kind of corporate world and in kind of with the white upper classes. I think that's one to recommend. Can I think of anything else that I've read recently? Okay, a book called C Cross ANTO, which is a poetry collection by a writer called Joelle Taylor. And she is a lesbian, and it's about lesbian club life, and it's amazing. And she won the biggest poetry award in Britain for it, called the T.S. Eliot Prize.
And poetry is something I would have loved to discuss with you too, but our time is over. And I'm very happy that we had the opportunity to talk, and that I could get a glimpse into your narratives and the way you, the way you build your stories, build your thinking, and the way books shaped you, and particularly the way you shape us with giving us your stories through your books. Thank you, Bernardine. Thank you.